A very good evening from Kampala and good afternoon to those in the US. Welcome, Chair Bass, to the World Movement for Democracy Global Assembly. This is not the first time you have joined the Assembly. I remember vividly your participation in the Assembly in 2018 in Dakar, Senegal, at which you were one of the opening speakers at that Assembly. A lot of the things you said then still resonate with me up until now. If I may just highlight two of them that I have inscribed in my notebook and keep going back to it regularly. The first one is your reminder to all of us that democracy isn't a destination, it's a journey, and that we cannot take it for granted. I think for me, that was a rallying call for protecting democratic progress by everybody, every time, every day, remembering that democracy is always under attack. The second one is really your invitation to members of the civil society in restoring faith in government, in participating within government institutions to rid it of corruption and to bring the people's voices to government. Those two things resonate with me and remind me every day of the importance of our work here in Uganda. So welcome to the Assembly. Unlike the Dakar Assembly, in which there were 500 democracy activists from about 100 countries, this is online because of the pandemic. So nonetheless, welcome. On a personal note, let me extend to you my gratitude for your message of solidarity, calling for my release in December. So welcome to the Global Assembly, Chairwoman Bass.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here. And it really cannot wait until the pandemic is over. I'm not sure how often you have the World Assemblies, but I so look forward to being there the next time. And when I was there in 2018, just the hope, the aspiration, the energy of seeing people from all over the world fight for democracy was a moment and experience I'll never forget.
The Assembly is every other 2 years, so you'll always be welcome to join the Assembly. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much. So look, it is always important to recognize the great work that you do, such as the statement you issued recently demanding the release of the arrested Kenyan activist in UAE. These kind of statements are really important for many of us who are on the front line here in Uganda. And just to give you a quick update on the situation here in Uganda, a controversial election was held at the beginning of the year that came on the backdrop of reported cases of widespread human rights violations. This situation still remains tense, as hundreds of people disappeared or have been held in detention by the military courts since then. So cases of disappearances still continue. Young people who are seen as activists or agitating for change continue being picked up by military men in unmarked vans and have since disappeared. Efforts to find them are underway. Our work here is to document, is to make sure that we continue the search for people who have disappeared. Cases of extrajudicial killings have been widespread. The one that was widely reported is the November 18th and 19th killings on the streets of Uganda by security agencies. What is shocking about this is not just the extent of the killings, but the lack of accountability. The president of the country applauded security forces for killing people on the street. This is extrajudicial killings. We continue here in Uganda to demand for accountability, to document these cases for human rights violation, to go to courts to encourage victims to speak up. So statements such as yours are really, really important. And if you could speak very briefly about why you think these kind of statements are important from your perspective, we really appreciate.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I'm so glad that you are out and, the fight to get you released and our ongoing concerns about your safety, understanding that at any time your freedom can be taken away again. When I first came to Congress 10 years ago, I really did not understand the impact of the statements until there was an individual in another country that was arrested similar to yours for being oppositional to the government. And we tweeted, and the individual was released. And I realized that the statements are paid attention to because the US is paid attention to. And if a statement is made by my office on behalf of our subcommittee on Africa, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the House of Representatives, that carries a lot of weight. And I think it's important that we continue to do this and to speak out, to protect other people so that they can fight for democracy in their homeland.
For many of us here on the front line, to hear the moral leadership, the political leadership of the US in continuing to demand for respect for the rule of law, respect for human rights is really heartwarming, given the events of the past year. So thank you for finding your voices and speaking loudly to these issues. But in your position as a chair of the subcommittee on Africa, global health, global human rights, and international organization, you must be receiving a lot of communications from all over the world, seeing that events in Ethiopia, events in Myanmar, in Belarus, are deeply concerning. You must be inundated by requests for statements and the need to take action to speak against these violations. Cases of killings by the police, suppression of assembly rights, the intimidation of the media. It seems to me that there's a deluge of communication that you must be receiving. If you could, what do you think would be the role or the response of the US over and above these statements in pushing back against these reported cases of violations?
Well, first of all, the way we are organized in the committee is by geographic regions. So I have my hands full with the continent of Africa. So if there are requests that come in from other parts of the world, needless to say, it goes to the Congress members that are in charge of that particular area. But, there are a variety of things in our toolbox. There's billions of dollars of funding. There are restrictions that can be put in place to individuals or to countries. And so it's using those tools that are important. And then I happen to believe, and I said this when I was at the World Forum, it's also important for us to be open about the challenge to democratic space right here in the United States. I mean, we're in a fight for the right to vote. And we are also in a fight to reform policing in the United States. So I think it's very important that we are honest about our own challenges. But I always point out the difference is that I can be a dissident in the United States without having to worry about somebody drive up and hauling me out of my house. Now, that hasn't always been the case, but that is the case, in this current environment. And so I think the world is watching us. And I think it's important because it's easy for some leaders, and this has happened, as you can imagine, where I might criticize them for something and they turn it right back around on me and say, well, what about what's going on in your own country? So I think it's important for us to be clear that while we have challenges to our democratic space, we're not allowing those challenges to take over. And we're honest about them and are dealing with them in a nonviolent way. And I think that that is important, that we maintain that moral high ground.
Fantastic. That moral high ground means a lot for many of us who are facing the rising autocracy in our country. Here in Uganda, recently the US announced travel sanctions against people who, quote unquote, have been involved in diverting the democratic process. Many Ugandans have been demanding for more actions. For example, for Global Magnitsky citations for these individuals. It's been done before. The evidence that has been documented is readily available. And so is there any chance that, the different tools in your arsenals can be put to use to ensure that there's a high cost to the to abuse of human rights, to the diversion of our democratic process. Because as you may know all too well, the US is a very strong partner to the Ugandan government in many good initiatives in fighting terrorism.
Right.
Should we sacrifice these relationships for perhaps that broader concern, or are there tools we can deploy to ensure that there's a high cost for gross violations for human rights?
I think there are tools that we can employ without breaking our longstanding partnership.
Some of these tools, many Ugandans are asking, why can't we deploy them now? Because to be honest, many people thought that travel restrictions were a slap in the arms, as they are not exceedingly effective. Many are asking if there's an attempt to try and hold them under the Global Magnitsky Act.
There have not been discussions about that so far within the House of Representatives, but the White House, the Secretary of State, the State Department, the Senate, it is possible it's being discussed there. It is not being discussed so far in the House.
We would welcome the opportunity for that to be discussed. But if we can just move on to the next.
Well, I think, let me just say one more thing on this
Sure.
end. I think that you will see an action out of the House soon, but it will not be to call for the Magnitsky Act at this point, but you will see action.
Great. We look forward to those actions. I think many Ugandans will be delighted to hear that. But recently, the US president addressed the joint session of Congress, where he emphasized that his administration would prove that democracy works, and that it can deliver for the people, that the US would fight back against autocrats around the world. And his administration would prioritize diplomacy and the advancement of democracy. What do you see as the role of Congress in supporting these efforts, especially for the docket that you hold on Africa?
Well, I think that it's so important for us to show the world that we are back. I mean, we are coming off of 4 years of an administration that led a policy or policy initiatives that were in complete conflict with the direction the United States had been going on for many decades. And so I think that in 4 years, a level of trust and stability was raised, was brought into question. And so I think that this administration has a lot of repair work to do first in terms of repairing our relationships, agreements and treaties that were broken that have to be re-engaged, reestablished, reauthorized. So there's a lot of cleanup that has to be done. And I think that when the administration accomplishes that, you will see a lot of forward movement.
But what are the priorities for your subcommittee for the continent? Because there are many
priorities for our subcommittee. That's something different. First and foremost, it's COVID, and making sure that the African countries have the vaccines. But what I feel is as important, if not more important, is for the African countries to have the vaccines, but more important to have the capacity to manufacture vaccines. Because even transporting the vaccines, and a number of African countries have had to destroy or send vaccines back because they didn't have the capacity to get the shots in the arm. And so I think the world, frankly, needs to rally around that. And after that, it's honoring the slogan of the African Union, trade, not aid. And so given that there is the continent-wide trade agreement, what can the US do to be helpful to that? I look at foreign aid as the Obama administration did, which is not charity, but building capacity. And so given the role that health plays, what role can we play in strengthening the African health infrastructure? So those are some of our priorities. The continent, 2/3 of the continent still doesn't have electricity. How do we expand Power Africa? And then I'm also very interested in collaboration that we can do with the European Union. As the European Union is going through their racial reckoning and realizing the sins of the colonial period, it's time to look back at their current foreign policies, especially in regard to the natural resources of African countries, which Europe and the United States are so willing to take. What do we give back? How do we make sure that the African countries have the capacity to really maximize utilization of those natural resources as opposed to just extract it from the continent to use for our purposes?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, there's a lot in your hands. But if I may probe you further, just if you can offer some ideas on what you see as the role of the civil society, human rights defenders, and those in the audience today, and what role they can play in keeping democracy and human rights at the center of your, agenda for a secure world, agenda for a COVID-free, Africa, an educated Africa, and a poverty-free Africa. What role do you see?
You can't succeed on anything I just said without civil society, without democracy being protected, and without human rights. I just feel like historically, US foreign policy, especially on a congressional level, has always focused on the conflicts on the continent and have not done enough to address the root causes of those conflicts, which is why I talk about trade, not aid, capacity, all of those things. To me, those are the things, because countries use security, including the United States, use security as a reason to clamp down and to narrow democratic space. And so just like the pandemic was used as a way of saying, well, can't have an election, might need to change the Constitution, those kind of things. And so I feel that they are all interrelated. But I feel too often the United States deals on the surface and does not address the underlying social economic issues.
Well, that's really, really, for me, comforting to hear, because the accusation in the areas where we work is that civil society are agents of foreign power. They're up to no good. There's a rise of legislation to restrict the activities of civil society. So to hear that civil society should be front and center in all of these efforts is really, really, for me, resounding. And then thank you so much for that, restoring my faith, in that concept. But any final remarks before we skip this to the next session from you?
Well, just that, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak again at the World Forum, and I look forward to on the next couple of years when we can all meet in person. But we're all in this struggle together. And my background is from civil society. My background is as a dissident here. And so, as on the one hand, I focus on foreign policy, but I'm also fighting for the right to vote, fighting for the human rights of policing, that 3 people a day don't wind up being killed at the hands of police. So I feel the solidarity with the struggles that you have in your countries. Obviously they're different, but all of us together are fighting for democracy. Even where we have a developed democracy, we learned over the last 4 years, you sure better protect it. No democracy is a rock. It is a journey. It isn't a destination. And that journey can go south sometimes. And we experienced that. I think 4 years we had a hard lesson. And I'm hoping that we just learned it in this country and learned that even our democracy is fragile.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chairwoman Bass, for joining us in the Global Assembly this time. We hope that you can find time again to join us. On a personal note, let me thank you again for your message of solidarity. I hope that when I have the time, I will thank you in person and give you a huge, tight African hug. So thank you very much. Have a fantastic afternoon. Thank you for your good work.
Absolutely. Thank you as well.